Welcome to Biden Brief. The content of the briefing includes: police in Texas could arrest migrants under a bill that is moving closer to approval by the governor. Russia is executing own soldiers for not following orders, White House says. Israeli tanks raid Gaza ahead of invasion, while aid trickles in. Republican senators want to separate Israel funding from Ukraine aid. Congressman Dean Phillips to launch primary bid against Biden. Police in Texas could arrest migrants under a bill that is moving closer to approval by the governor. The Toronto Star. The state of Texas is moving closer to granting police greater powers to arrest and order migrants to leave the U.S., with a bill passing the state house on Thursday. The bill, which has already cleared the Texas Senate, would allow all Texas law enforcement officers to arrest migrants and transport them to the border, where they would be ordered into Mexico. Critics have argued that the proposal would lead to the arrest of U.S. citizens and put families of mixed immigration status at risk. Russia is executing own soldiers for not following orders, White House says. South China Morning Post. The White House has accused Russia of executing soldiers who have failed to follow orders and threatening entire units with death if they retreat from Ukrainian artillery fire. The U.S. national security officials believe that these actions reflect Russia's morale problems 20 months into its invasion of Ukraine. The U.S. administration has previously said that it has acted to disclose intelligence about Russian action over the course of the war to highlight plans for Russian misinformation and other activity to allies. This latest unveiling of intelligence about Russia's struggles comes as U.S. President Joe Biden is pressing the Republican-controlled House to provide more funding for Ukraine. President Putin is said to be not giving up on his aspirations to take all of Ukraine. Meanwhile, Slovakia's new populist Prime Minister Robert Fico has informed the European Union's executive of his decision to stop military aid to Ukraine. Slovakia is one of the most pro-Russian countries in the European Union, according to the Bratislava-based Globsec think tank. Israeli tanks raid Gaza ahead of invasion, while aid trickles in. New York Times. The Israeli military has sent tanks into the northern Gaza Strip in preparation for the next stage of fighting, according to a statement released on Thursday. This comes after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu indicated that a ground invasion was likely. Israel has been carrying out an intense aerial and artillery bombardment on Gaza since a Hamas attack on October 7, which killed over 1,400 people and took over 200 hostages. The Hamas-controlled government in Gaza has claimed that over 7,000 people have been killed and nearly 2,000 others are trapped in destroyed buildings, although these figures have not been verified. The United Nations has stated that over half of Gaza's population of over 2 million people have been displaced as a result of the Israeli bombardment. Meanwhile, international aid agencies have criticized Israel for slowing down the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Israel insists on inspecting each shipment, resulting in a slow trickle of aid reaching the territory. There is widespread expectation that Israel will launch a full-scale invasion of Gaza to try to rout Hamas from its network of tunnels and hideouts. Republican senators want to separate Israel funding from Ukraine aid. The Independent. Conservative senators in the U.S., including J.D. Vance, Ted Cruz, Mike Lee and Roger Marshall, are seeking to separate military aid packages for Ukraine and Israel. They argue that continued support for Ukraine risks escalating the conflict into a global war. However, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell opposes the idea, stating that the issues should be viewed as interconnected. Military leaders, including Mark Milley, argue that supporting Ukraine against Russia is crucial for countering Russian military aggression. The political situation in the House remains uncertain, with new Speaker Mike Johnson yet to clarify his position on Ukraine funding. Congressman Dean Phillips to launch primary bid against Biden. The Guardian. Democratic Congressman Dean Phillips from Minnesota is reportedly planning to launch a long-shot primary campaign against President Joe Biden in New Hampshire. Phillips, who is significantly younger than Biden, has pointed to the president's age as a reason for his potential run, saying that the next generation of leaders should step up. However, there is little difference between Phillips and Biden on policy, and Phillips has voted with Biden's legislative agenda nearly 100% of the time. Phillips's plan to primary an incumbent president has been met with confusion and derision from his colleagues and constituents. The Minnesota Democratic Farmer-Labor Party has confirmed that it will be supporting Biden in the primary and general elections in 2024. Teachers' advocates challenge private school voucher program in South Carolina. Associated Press. A group of South Carolina parents and teachers' advocates filed a challenge Thursday to a new Republican-backed law allowing taxpayer dollars to help families pay for private schools. U.S. Appeals Court blocks Gulf of Mexico oil and gas sale expansion pending appeal. Reuters. A U.S. appeals court has temporarily halted a federal judge's order requiring the Biden administration to expand a planned offshore oil and gas auction in the Gulf of Mexico. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit stayed the September decision pending an appeal, with oral arguments scheduled for November 13. The order was the latest development in a legal fight over offshore drilling and federal protection of the endangered Rice's whale. The oil and gas industry and the state of Louisiana sued the Interior Department in August over its decision to scale back an auction to reduce conflicts with the whale's habitat. House Speaker Mike Johnson's first big bill cuts Biden's climate change funding. Bloomberg. House Republicans have passed legislation that would cut billions of dollars in consumer rebates for energy efficiency upgrades included in President Joe Biden's signature climate law. The $58 billion measure, which funds the Energy Department and other agencies, would rescind over $5.5 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act, including a $4.5 billion program for homeowners to switch to more energy-efficient appliances and a $1 billion grant program to help states craft more stringent building energy codes. The bill also slashes funding for the Energy Department's Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office by 42% and revokes $15 billion in loan authority from the department's loan guarantee program. The House measure is not expected to pass the Democratic Senate or receive Biden's signature without changes. Republican-led U.S. states appeal ruling allowing Biden ESG investing rule. Reuters. A group of Republican-led U.S. states plans to appeal a federal judge's decision rejecting their challenge to a rule by President Joe Biden's administration that allows employee retirement plans to consider environmental, social, and governance (ESG) issues in investment decisions. The 26 states, led by Texas and Utah, filed a notice of appeal in federal court. The appeal will go to the New Orleans-based Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, which is considered one of the most conservative federal appeals courts. The rule, adopted last year by the U.S. Labor Department, overturns a 2020 rule restricting ESG investing by retirement plans. FTC's Amazon case threatens attorney-client privilege, corporate lawyer group says. Reuters. The Association of Corporate Counsel has filed a friend of the court brief in the Federal Trade Commission's FTC lawsuit against Amazon, arguing that the agency's case unfairly uses communications between Amazon and its lawyers as evidence. The group warns that the lawsuit wrongly suggests that Amazon officials knew they were breaking consumer protection laws because they were in regular contact with lawyers familiar with the regulations in question. The FTC has accused Amazon of deceptive consumer practices in relation to its Prime paid membership service. A non-jury trial in the case is scheduled for February 2025. Russia says it will build close ties with North Korea in all areas. South China Morning Post. Russia has said it plans to build close ties with North Korea in all areas, despite accusations from South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. that weapons supplies have been sent from Pyongyang to Moscow. Russia has dismissed these accusations as groundless and stated that it will continue to develop relations with North Korea. The UK's Defence Ministry has also claimed that North Korea has sent over 1,000 containers of munitions to Russia in the past few weeks, and is on track to becoming one of Russia's biggest foreign arms suppliers. The US and its allies have expressed concern that North Korea could provide weapons and ammunition to Russia, which is currently involved in the war in Ukraine. Cost of living is the dragon the government can't slay. ABC. The timing of Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's state visit to the US is not ideal, as many Australian families are facing financial anxiety due to mortgage payments. The Reserve Bank's recent inflation figures have sparked speculation about a potential interest rate increase, which would further exacerbate the cost of living pressures faced by households. Treasurer Jim Chalmers emphasized that the government's measures to alleviate these pressures have only made a marginal difference for the average household. Meanwhile, Albanese's visit to Washington is crucial for Australia's efforts to push along the implementation of the AUKUS agreement. However, if the cost of living crisis persists and takes a toll on Labor's popularity, it could restrict the government's ability to pursue its broader objectives and reforms. The public's anger has not yet been directed at the government, but if it does, it could quickly consume the government's political capital. The government hopes that the Reserve Bank will hold the line on interest rates in the next 2 months to avoid added pressure. Why U.S. auto workers' strike drags on as costs mount. Bloomberg. The United Auto Workers, UAW, strike against major U.S. automakers, including General Motors, GM, Ford, and Stellantis, has entered its 6th week with no resolution in sight. The UAW and Ford reached a tentative agreement on a new 4-year, 8-month contract on October 25, which includes a record 25% hourly wage increase. However, details of the contract remain unknown, including whether it will cover workers at Ford's planned battery plants for electric vehicles. The strikes have cost the automakers a combined $2.5 billion in earnings through October 26. The UAW is seeking pay raises, the restoration of benefits, and good wages and benefits for workers making electric vehicles. The union is also demanding the restoration of traditional pensions and retiree health care, and a reduction in the workweek to 32 hours from 40. The automakers argue they need to keep costs down to remain competitive, while the UAW contends that the companies can afford the pay increases after years of record profits. The transition to electric vehicles is another point of contention, as it will lead to plant closures and affect wages and benefits for workers in the new EV plants. Ex-president accused of witness threats after Meadows reportedly granted immunity. The Guardian. Special counsel Jack Smith has accused former President Donald Trump of trying to intimidate witnesses in the federal election interference case against him. Smith made the accusation in a court filing seeking a limited gag order. This comes after Trump's former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, was granted immunity. Trump faces multiple charges related to his attempts to overturn his defeat to Joe Biden in the 2020 U.S. presidential election. Trump ally Blake Masters announces House run in Arizona after failed Senate bid. Washington Post. Republican venture capitalist Blake Masters, an ally of former President Donald Trump, has announced that he will run for a seat in the House of Representatives to replace Representative Debbie Lesko in Arizona's 8th congressional district. Masters stated that he will focus on tackling inflation, U.S.-Mexico border security, and water security. Masters previously ran for the U.S. Senate in 2022, but lost to incumbent Democrat Senator Mark Kelly. What the U.S. can learn from Australia's Great China Thaw. Bloomberg. The recent collisions between Chinese and Philippine vessels in the South China Sea have sparked a diplomatic dispute, with both sides blaming each other. The U.S. has reminded China that the Philippines is not alone in the waterway, and President Joe Biden has reaffirmed support for the U.S.'s treaty partner. However, tensions remain high in the South China Sea. The author suggests that a strategy of constructive dialogue combined with deterrence, similar to Australia's approach, could be effective in dealing with China's assertive actions in the region. Republican U.S. House Speaker Johnson likely couldn't reprise Trump election fight, analysts say. Reuters. Mike Johnson, the new Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, has drawn attention for his efforts to overturn Donald Trump's 2020 election defeat. However, a new law passed as a response to the chaos of January 6, 2021, will make it much harder for lawmakers to challenge the results of future elections. The law requires approval of 1/5 of the House and Senate to consider a challenge to a state's results, a much higher bar than before when any single lawmaker from each chamber had the ability to trigger a challenge. 2020 for Republican contender DeSantis facilitates shipment of weapons, ammunition to Israel. Reuters. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has sent cargo planes carrying drones, body armor, and helmets to Israel, and has worked with private parties to send weapons and ammunition, according to a statement from his office. The details of the shipments, including their origin and the specific third parties involved, have not been disclosed. While it is legal for a U.S. state to send aid to a foreign government, the export of ammunition and military equipment typically requires compliance with U.S. export license requirements. Governor DeSantis, who is running for the Republican nomination in the 2024 presidential race, has tried to position himself as a strong ally of Israel. A Reuters Ipsos poll conducted in October found that a majority of Republicans believed the U.S. should support Israel in its conflict with Hamas. Israel conducts largest Gaza raid yet amid growing calls for ceasefire. Washington Post. Israeli forces conducted an overnight raid in the northern Gaza Strip as part of preparations for the next stages of combat, referring to a possible ground offensive. The raid came a day after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated that a ground assault could occur at any time. Over the past few weeks, Israel's military plans have caused increasing concern for humanitarian officials, diplomats, and aid workers over the dire situation in Gaza, and the certainty that without a halt in fighting, things will only get worse. The warnings coming from the United Nations and an increasingly united group of Middle Eastern states have angered Israeli officials and challenged the Biden administration's repeated support for Israel's right to self-defense. The UN General Assembly met in New York on Thursday to discuss and vote on a joint Arab resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire. Gaza's health ministry has said that over 7,082 Palestinians have been killed since the beginning of Israel's military operations. Denmark donates $520 million in military aid to Ukraine. Yahoo! Denmark has pledged to provide Ukraine with a military aid package worth $520 million, which includes tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery shells, drones, and small arms. The donation also includes engineering and recovery vehicles, which have been co-financed by Germany. Denmark has already provided Ukraine with $2.3 billion in military aid and $354 million in civilian contributions since the start of the Russian invasion. Denmark is also one of the few countries to have pledged to supply Ukraine with F-16 fighter jets. Well, my observant audience, it seems we have quite the mix of news today. From Texas granting police greater powers to arrest migrants, to Russia executing its own soldiers for not following orders, to Israel preparing for a possible ground invasion of Gaza, there's no shortage of headlines. Let's start with Texas. Now, I know everything is bigger in Texas, but giving police the authority to arrest migrants and send them back to Mexico. That's quite the power move. Critics, however, argue that this could lead to the arrest of U.S. citizens and put families of mixed immigration status at risk. It's a sticky situation, to say the least. Moving on to Russia, it seems their morale problems 20 months into the invasion of Ukraine are causing some serious issues. The White House has accused Russia of executing soldiers who fail to follow orders and threatening entire units with death if they retreat from Ukrainian artillery fire. Talk about tough love, huh? Meanwhile, Slovakia's new populist prime minister has decided to stop military aid to Ukraine, further complicating the situation. And speaking of complications, Israel has sent tanks into the northern Gaza Strip in preparation for a possible ground invasion. Tensions in the region have been escalating, and it seems a full-scale invasion may be on the horizon. While Israel claims it is targeting Hamas, aid agencies have criticized Israel for slowing down the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. It's a delicate balance between military action and humanitarian concerns. In the U.S., Republican senators are seeking to separate military aid packages for Ukraine and Israel. They argue that continued support for Ukraine risks escalating the conflict into a global war. On the other hand, military leaders argue that supporting Ukraine against Russia is crucial for countering Russian military aggression. It's a tough decision, and it remains to be seen how it will play out. Now, let's talk about something a little closer to home, shall we? Democratic Congressman Dean Phillips from Minnesota is reportedly planning to launch a primary campaign against President Joe Biden. Phillips has pointed to Biden's age as a reason for his potential run, saying that the next generation of leaders should step up. However, there doesn't seem to be much difference between Phillips and Biden on policy, so it's a bit puzzling why he would take on an incumbent president from his own party. Moving on, there's a challenge to a new Republican-backed law in South Carolina that allows taxpayer dollars to help families pay for private schools. A group of parents and teachers advocates are arguing that this law is unfair and goes against public education. It's a battle between private and public education, and it's a fight that's been going on for quite some time. And lastly, we have a mix of news from the business world. A U.S. appeals court has temporarily halted a federal judge's order requiring the Biden administration to expand a planned offshore oil and gas auction in the Gulf of Mexico. The court will hear arguments on the matter in November. Meanwhile, House Republicans have passed legislation that would cut billions of dollars in consumer rebates for energy efficiency upgrades included in President Biden's climate law. And a group of Republican-led states is planning to appeal a federal judge's decision rejecting their challenge to a rule that allows employee retirement plans to consider environmental, social, and governance issues in investment decisions. Phew, that was quite the whirlwind of news, wasn't it? Now, I know I've shared my thoughts and analysis on these stories, but I'm curious to hear what you, my clever audience, think. Do you have any thoughts or questions on these topics? The floor is yours. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.